Hello, my name is Ryan Durgasing, and welcome to the University of the West Indies Press's launch of 1000 Eyes, the fifth novel by award-winning writer Barbara Lalla. In her latest book, Barbara tackles the uncertainty of our future through a dystopian lens, extrapolating from the myriad challenges of today to situate her young characters in a world transformed by destruction. In 1000 Eyes, she again brings her keen imagination and lucid prose to bear on the Caribbean space, showing us a vision of what could be if we do not take heed. In this launch, we will be treated to readings from Barbara, a review of the new novel by Paula Morgan, and an interview where Barbara sits down with me to talk about 1000 Eyes. There's no better way to begin, then, than to have Barbara open the text to us. Barbara?
Reading from 1000 Eyes. In 1000 Eyes, a group of abandoned children from various Caribbean nations find themselves on one island. They have little or no idea of what happened before. In a small sanctuary they know only as the Trust, they form connections with wild things, like the ocelots. They shelter from outsiders they call grottos, but also from two who once belonged to their group, twins who have retained the names Myche and treacherous. I'll read from the very beginning of the first chapter, called Shards. Only my grandmother called me Kiskili, and that was because our real names were the same. She never spoke of the part she played in the end, only of those earlier blasts that had shattered the place to begin with. She had heard about things before the flash, the thunder and breaking apart, the floating cinders as paper, as shells, and even whole libraries gushed flame, then shriveled and curled away into ash. Before, she said, people seemed to have lived together without seeing each other at all. Why they couldn't see? I grappled with it. People were small, like our ants. An ant, she stroked my cheek. No, she said, normal size. But they only saw differences between temples and hair and bank accounts, as if they lived in separate worlds, she said. And when the country came falling apart around them, very few cared whether the rest lived or died. They never even noticed those around, just looked right through them. I shivered. Like ghosts, I whispered. Sometimes these slivers of information were sharp-edged. Right, she nodded. So they arrived at this uncomfortable thought. Perhaps they were all of them, specters. What happened next was not to be found in any official record. For who was there to write it down, and what was there to write on? Versions of the story passed down mainly from mouth to mouth, but mostly it was just as if those who survived had never existed at all before. Still, all around, the tortured countryside itself testified that fire did tear open the night sky and smoke blotted out the sun. People groped around, disoriented by ruins everywhere, before taking up various haunts, coming and going as they found convenient and making up accounts of how they had got to where they were, which was nowhere. And then the grottos came, slashing their way through the bush and whoever stood up to them and snatching up whom they pleased. There was nothing left to do but hide. As for the flotsam, those other children, no one paid them any mind, for they never lasted long.
Thank you so much for that short taste of 1000 Eyes, Barbara. I now have the privilege of introducing Paula Morgan, who will give us her thoughts in a review of the new novel. Paula is Professor of West Indian Literature and Culture and University Director of the Regional Coordinating Office of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, UWI, Regional Headquarters, Mona, Jamaica. The focus of Professor Morgan's research includes gendered violence and trauma, crime and its representation in the Anglophone Caribbean, and pedagogical approaches to Caribbean literature and culture. Professor Morgan has published numerous essays and over 10 single-authored, co-authored, or co-edited journal collections, instructional texts, and scholarly books, including The Terror and the Time, Banal Violence and Trauma in Caribbean Discourse, available via UWI Press. Paula Morgan has received awards for teaching, publication, and graduate supervision. Welcome, Paula.
Barbara Lalla's 1000 Eyes is a dystopian novel in which cataclysmic man-made conflagration alongside natural disasters destroy a small Caribbean island society. The 300-page five-part narrative presents a minutely sketched, inhumane speculative world in which any form of protective environment for its most vulnerable citizens, its children, has been destroyed. The post-apocalyptic society is overtaken by pirates who throw children overboard into tumultuous seas to find their way to land and to fend for themselves in tropical forests teeming with dangers and threats. Here they band into a ragged, largely pre-adolescent makeshift family, ever vigilant against pirates known as recruiters, who return regularly to capture those who have matured sufficiently to have commercial value as productive, reproductive, and sexual labor. The novel grips the reader from the first page and maintains its invasive magical hold as part mystery, part quest, part horror, and wholly evocative of a deep pathos for its ragged band of children battling against overwhelming odds. The children, under the leadership of the intrepid preteen Myche, forage for food and protection against exposure and disease. But even more so, they cast around for values, for knowledge and wisdom, and for love. Lalla's cautionary tale focuses on what is at stake for our youngest and most vulnerable citizens, the perils they are likely to face should existing trajectories arrive at their preset destinations. In keeping with the conventions of the genre, this dystopia, though firmly rooted in speculative possible worlds, is completely plausible. The root of multiple crises and catastrophes is a human greed ripened and rampant in the late capitalist global systemic, with endemic social inequities, race and class hierarchies, lack of respect and reciprocity. In short, the socially sanctioned destruction of humane values. Featured in its machinations are ruptured families and bloodlines, stolen people cut loose from cultural and spiritual moorings, ocean vessels carrying stolen human cargo, which are hellholes of violence and sexual abuse, human beings dumped alive into tumultuous seas, hunger, torture, traumatic stress, and wilderness landscapes with lurking dangers, poisonous bodies of water, vicious serpents, stinging insects. In short, the novel indicates that just as the slave ship and the transatlantic ocean journey and plantation life were horrific dystopian spaces for the enslaved, unless present trajectories are interrupted, the same can recur on, and I quote, jewels so bright and rich, end quote, within the network of islands, quote again, floating in a sparkling sea, end quote. The deepest and most enduring loss in Lalla's novels is the loss of knowledge and wisdom to guide the children on their quest for the mores and values of viable human civilization. On one level, this is reflected in loss of repositories of knowledge, books, libraries, and albeit inadequate museums and archives. At a deeper level, it is the loss of the capacity to read and apply wisdom to the conduct of daily life. At the deepest level, as reflected in the reconstructed post-apocalyptic social order, it is the collective loss of viable human values and civilities which allow for harmony, order, and the flourishing of the human spirit. This is what the children must unearth, reconstruct, or even invent. The lacuna is reflected in space and time. At the beginning of the narrative, the children are holed up in the trust, a relatively safe place, masked by vigorous undergrowth and patrolled by partially tamed orphaned ocelots, stolen in infancy from their mother's nest and attached to individual children, as pets. They sleep in a decaying museum, all the while searching in vain for a usable past, a narrative that would map how they have arrived here, or put even more fundamentally, where is here? The traumas which they have endured dictate that having spent substantial time forgetting the pain of the past, how and what can they remember in order to craft a viable future? The text engages the challenges of reconstruction and remembering, which are relevant to the present day Caribbean. How to reconstruct a reality which is so painful that it has sunk into a sea of forgetfulness, and how to chart a path out of an existing social morass without dredging up and reconstructing the anguish-ridden pitfalls of the past. Towards this end, the narrative probes the power and potentiality of language and storytelling. Clearly evident is the linguist's concern with language, naming and its impact on identity and worldview. The capacity of language to foster community when strange children from distant places find themselves thrown together into makeshift families whose survival depends on their capacity to make themselves understood. Some of the stories, like those spun by the older children who assume the role of caregivers, are cautionary tales to prevent the smallies from venturing too far from the trust and the group. Others are told by adults who live in marronage in the outer domain of the don't trust. These include selective narratives spun by the relatively benign Banya or bush people who respond to the societal conflagration by returning to the forest. Given their return to a pre-literate social order, even their griots and chanters have fallen short in their roles, as their stories are skewed ideologically and intended to safeguard their lifestyles and communities, even while they seek to woo the wandering children for the potential of their reproductive capacities to infuse life and vigor into their isolated settlements. There are also stories whispered urgently by Shine, the absent past leader and future savior, intended to guard his siblings, Myche and Bran, who lead the ragged, wandering gang of children in their quest for a safe place. All the while, the threat looms of being hunted by recruiters for sale, for which sake they leave the Trust Act and are condemned to chronic migrancy. I quote, no place to settle, nowhere to step with any certainty, dry leaves in the wind and underfoot, forever looking over their shoulders. The title of the novel, 1000 Eyes, is taken from the strangest inhabitants of this fictional world, an exceptional ocelot. It is from mimicking and living closely with these animals the children learn how to survive in the wild. And this is where the eco-dystopia veers into the supernatural realm. Lalla seems to posit that given the abject failure of the novel's social order, there is benefit to be derived to returning to mystical psychic connection with animals. This gives some credence to answering the distorted ascendancy and hegemonies which propel imperial and neo-imperial impulses with the recognition of the creatureliness of humans and their kinship with the animals as fellow created beings within a shared and interconnected natural environment. This resonates with what Wilson Harris identifies as a profound and unusual treaty of sensibility between human presence of this planet and the animal kingdom. Harris goes on to call for a dialogue of creativity that is aware of the mystery of the sacred as it inhabits the psyche. Within this frame, Lalla, in some measure, echoes also Hopkinson's evocation of duendom in Midnight Robber. Hopkinson's duends are shape-shifting, more human than animalistic figures who are constantly being undervalued and unrecognized but they function as repositories of what Harris terms a numinous inexactitude, a variable and life fluid enhancing diversity. In Lalla's narrative, the term dwen is deployed to describe the otherness of the ragged bush children within the hegemonic order when they are captured and sold into domestic servitude in the reconstructed island civilization. This otherness is best represented in Myche. It imparts resilience and strength and the appropriating power of the gaze. She moves unobserved among the pretentious and inauthentic upper strata, easily penetrating their duplicities and impaling them with her knowing, all the while escaping observation because she's essentialized as a dwen, a non-person. This is where the power of the dystopia gains its fullest meaning. The text is titled 1000 Eyes, after the mythical heavenly ocelot of the children's narrative, a bigger, heavier, fiercer ocelot, I quote, with 1,000 glimmering eyes, which lay sprawled above them, waiting to lunge down from the sky and devour whoever came to harm a child, close quotation. Myche so names the unique cat her brother gives her, and he becomes the embodiment of his name, following, protecting, rescuing, and at times even providing food for the children in their migrancy. The capacity of the ragged band of children and animals to generate kinship and interdependency constitutes the greatest rebuke of the novel. This stands in stark contrast with the savagery of the corrupt architects of the reconstructed social order, who greet the process of emerging from apocalyptic destruction with even more greed and more stringent hierarchies. The text is haunted with the specter of colonialism, with its ruined death, torture, derelict buildings and corpses. The leaders of the re-emerging society avidly embrace the commoditization of those who are different. Here, Lalla troubles the race binaries and the logic of white supremacy, unveiling the naked greed at its root. Reflecting again the values of colonial societies, the words that the corrupt and wealthy set up as a utopia, replete with beautiful objects, refined values, and prestigious events, is revealed as the savage dystopia that it is. It is the bush children who must take the initiative to destroy it if a viable social and natural ecology is to be restored. How they do so is a bizarre twist, which I have thought about at length, but enough said. This mystery is one you must probe for yourself, and in order to do so, you have to read the novel. I highly recommend this layered and complex narrative to your attention. Spun by a skillful storyteller, I have every confidence that it will be profitably read by diverse audiences ranging from young adults to tertiary scholars. Unfortunately, this is a narrative whose relevance and resonances stand poised to increase. Fortunately, it is a cautionary tale that will stand the test of time. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you for those wonderful insights into the novel, Professor Morgan. I would now like to invite Barbara to read to us once more from 1000 Eyes.
Tourists again, Thelma said. Tourists can be good, smarty, but they can't take care of you because they don't have nowhere that belongs to them to take care of you in. Sometimes them can't take care of themselves, much less. How do you think me and Dorothy land up here? Thelma remembered, and probably Dorothy did as well, even though she didn't talk about it. Well, Dorothy didn't talk at all anymore. Thelma and Dorothy came from a larger island further north. They had lived in town. It was a tight, loud place with heat radiating off the sheets of metal that were walls and roof. Thelma called it zinc, though now she said galvanized so the others would understand. When their stepfather put them out, they walked and walked till they came to a wide open paved space on the waterfront. Thelma and Dorothy had found their way there a year before and learned to dive for coins white people threw from ships and shoot back up to the surface with a money or two in their fists. But now they looked about for food. So one day they were searching a bin where people threw leftover food and stuff cleaners swept up from the street, as well as the fish guts dumped by the couple of fishermen who had cast a net from the dock because their boat had been stolen from them long before. That was when a woman called out to ask the two little girl children rifling through the garbage whether they wanted a thing called plantain tart. Want plantain tart? Any picnic would have killed for plantain tart. The woman said somebody bought it for her to try, but she didn't fancy it. She had thought the thing would have meat. The tourist lady watched them closely while they were yamming down the pastry, and she decided to buy them chicken. She told them her name, but it wasn't anything they could pronounce, and since it made no sense to them, they now remembered her only as tourist lady. Anyway, now they were friends with this tourist lady who had come off a cruise ship and was getting ready to board again. And just as she was saying that she wished she could take them along, what had become a crowd thickened, tightening around them, desperate people shouting and cursing on the waterfront, demanding to get on the cruise ship. The people in charge of the ship hustled their passengers onto the launches and up the narrow steps on the side of the ship. Then the ship pulled away as fast as it could go because people on the shore were pushing off in any little thing that could float, and some just threw themselves into the water and swam frantically for the ship. But somehow in this fracas, tourist lady managed to smuggle the two little girls, born and growing ghetto, onto the ship. One big shiny ship with brass rail and glass cut in pretty shapes tinkling around the lights overhead. In no time, she had them bathed and dressed in two of her t-shirts, which fitted them like dresses, and she said she would grease some palms to keep the children with her, whatever that meant. It sounded to Thelma like some sort of dirty work. Only in no time, it came down to the same story. They were barely out to sea when another boat drew up with man and woman cursing and slashing, ordering some people into cabins and locking them in. When some of the crew on the cruise ship agreed to join up with them roughly, and that was that. The people who had taken charge separated the adults into groups, deciding who they could get money for and locked those up. They threw the rest overboard. Some they shot first, some they didn't. And one of them was tourist lady. The children scrambled away into every crevice they could find, behind stacks of beach chairs, under lifeboats, every nook. But there was no escape. The recruiters sailed that cruise ship with their own boat close behind till they reached whatever point suited them. Then they told these children that the water near the shore was rough that day, and they must do the best they could to reach land and stay alive till they were big enough to be useful. And they throw these children in the water. Plenty picnic, as Thelma recalled, might be 30 or so, but most couldn't swim at all, let alone in rough sea, or not so far. In the end, just 5 or 6 washed up that time. Every year, those people the children called recruiters came back for whomsoever they wanted. But the rule was not to talk about that. Still, the stories passed back and forth and grew. Some of the bigger children could read, or Shine had read to them, but others, especially the younger ones, could not. So the bigger ones told stories. Everyone liked to hear about ocelots, how their eyes lit up the night, and how the rings on their fur were eyes too, how a bigger, heavier, fiercer ocelot with 1,000 glimmering eyes lay sprawled above them, waiting to lunge down from the sky and devour whoever came to harm a child. Good thing if he came for Questus or Tweetums, preferably both. The twins were almost identical in build, flesh stacked on by yamming down all the food they'd bullied from the smallies. They had lost some teeth and smelt like they'd never bathed in their lives, and who had there been to make them? When they ate, they left trails of banana peel behind them for a picnic to slide on, or fish bones to chuck bare feet. Then it was Dorothy's job to prise the bone from the bawling, struggling child because it had to come out before the little wound turned hard and hot, circled in angry red or purple. Someone had to hold that smallie down while Dorothy tried to grip the end of the bone before it worked its way deeper in the foot bottom. After a while, Thelma said, it come like it's just easier to clean up after them beasts. Now the children in the trust had to keep watch over the perimeters. It was just as well the new girl Janice was good for that at least. This Janice was jumpy, like Marilyn, but a good watcher when she could take her eye off the 2 picnics she had got to shore. But she was spoiling them. Anything they wanted, she gave them. Josiah Marshall wanted attention nonstop. He was forever making stupid jokes and only Janice laughed at, while the baby, Tiffany they called her, refused to unclench her arms from Janice's neck and screamed if anyone else touched her. When she finally started creeping, that was when the twins decided to drop in again for a couple of days, and Quessos kicked Tiffany aside to grab up a set of good deep red pomerac that Brand had just brought down. Well, Brand lowered his head and drove it at Quessos full force, right in his belly. Myche grabbed up the picnic and handed her to Janice, then turned with the rest of the 2 brothers with branches, ropey vines, anything they could grab up, and they lashed Quessos on tweetons till they scrambled back over the fence. So that was how they drove out those 2 brutes for good. Thelma always thought it was a good day's work. She and Myche, Brand, Vicky, and a couple others chased the twins into the bush. She and Vicky screamed they would tie them up, leave them for Corbo, or throw them for Cayman, or nail them down to an ant's nest. At last, even Brand was satisfied to head back. After that, the twins mostly stayed away. Sometimes they came sneaking near the fence. Only that could have get them ocelot riled up so. The twins had the habit of stoning the cats whenever they could, so the children would hear hissing and growling at night and heavy bodies plunging through bush and dry leaves underfoot. Whether the twins eventually went off on their own or the Crouters took them would have been good news either way, as Dorothy had liked saying a couple years back. She did talk then. But 2 years ago, Dorothy lost Spat. Spat was older than most ocelot kids were when a litter was robbed. And even after a year when Dorothy and Thelma, when Spat knew them well, they didn't leave him free outside the trust in case he ran away. Not tame, Thelma had said. Is that what make us tie out Spat in the bush when Dorothy and me and the rest take him gone out the trust looking for egg? We say he wouldn't able jump up in a tree like the rest of the puss them and get lost. And it's then the men come down on us. Huge, fierce men, swiping the bush with machetes. The children screamed and scattered. Only Dorothy crouched down beside Spat and refused to leave him. So Thelma Wan crawled back to see. Nah, we're not taking you yet, one of the men told Dorothy. He gave her a grin so friendly that Thelma could feel it crawl along her skin. You were worth more later. Then he wrenched Spat away with one hand and swiped down the blade with the other. And in no time, Spat's skin rip off and everything's supposed to be inside the puss skin on the ground, and they kick it away. Then the same man threw the skin over his shoulder and grinned at Dorothy again. He said, how you fat and nice, I'll go come back for your skin too, next year or so. It was after that happened that Myche, Celia, and Shine started to insist the younger ones stay in the trust all the time. Dorothy had never spoken since. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Barbara. We now move into an interview session where Barbara and I discuss the new novel with questions drawn from other notable Caribbean writers. Welcome. Before retiring in 2010 from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Professor Emeritus Barbara Lalla taught and published in the fields of language and literature for over 3 decades. In addition to her scholarly output, a dozen single-authored, co-authored, or co-edited books, dozens of peer-reviewed articles, and numerous research projects, Barbara is an award-winning creative writer of now 5 novels. Her latest, 1000 Eyes, has now been published. The novel follows a group of children cast aside and adrift on a not quite unfamiliar future Caribbean island, reeling from some apocalyptic destruction that they are struggling to comprehend. Their search for safety in this environment, physical and psychological, is told via a richly, sometimes painfully, realized narrative of journey, loss, and recollection. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you.
Good. So the first thing I wanted to ask was about storytelling. Who tells what, when, and why to whom, and just as importantly, what is withheld, is an important feature of 1000 Eyes. Can you tell us more about your approach to stories and narratives in the book?
Yes, thank you, Ryan. That's crucial. And it's crucial because I think life depends on stories, but stories that get passed along change in the passage. Rumor reshapes information. All of these children have, all the children have is speculation and hearsay. It was the only way I could think of to make departure from realism realistic. I needed a defamiliarized Caribbean, and I tried for it by bringing together children from different islands with their different voices and with whatever fragments of memory they had left. So this is sort of a story about stories. Each child brings a few bits. Also, the children construct stories in an effort to understand the world they've found themselves in. Adults they eventually encounter relay whatever accounts suit them, and somebody else tries to piece it together. And that is actually how things work. If you listen to the news, you keep finding yourself saying, how do we know what is real and what is true? And is there ever a whole story? And somehow you have to put together the bits that you feel you can trust to arrive at what may be nearly the whole story. I think that was the path I was taking there.
Yeah, and I think it's very obvious as well, the role that rumor plays, and this is something that you've talked about before as well. Hearsay and recollection are big parts of the novel as well, how the children go about reconstructing what has been. So in addition to me talking to you today, we also asked other authors to weigh in on the book. And so we've asked some of them to send in some questions, and I have a couple here. And so this one is from Karen Lord. Our region's history has more than once experienced the sharp break, the gradual apocalypse, and the even more gradual recovery. Back then, when certain truths were not allowed to survive, we stored our knowledge in folklore. And you've shown the same process in this book. In your opinion, what modern day alternatives do we have for preserving and disseminating inconvenient truths?
Well, I think the characters in the book resort to folklore and they mythologize so as to find their way. I adopted the speculative so as to propose a possible world for real beings, actual humans in natural landscapes, natural spaces. And we're moving in a direction that was not impossible, though unlike what most of us would currently foresee, what most of us would feel comfortable foreseeing. The break in the case of this story is so sharp, so traumatic, that there's actually a blotting out. There is a conscious need to forget that helps to suppress parts of the story so that things just float up in little bits here and there later. And that means that the recovery has to be gradual because what you're doing is there's a sort of balance between suppressing and retrieving and dredging up.
Yes,
and
of course.
I think that is how it works.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so much of trauma response really is that, like when can you deal with the difficult thing? And that's something that the characters are constantly grappling with, what to allow themselves to remember from the before and what to remember now. Yeah, for sure. I think that is a very, very good point. Okay, so related to that question, I wondered about the choice of centering the Caribbean in a dystopia. How, if at all, does the genre help us to interrogate and navigate the Caribbean's past and its present?
Yes, well, I think that our past is pretty unbelievable. If there are things that are almost impossible to think about in detail, some of the things that have happened in the past. Similarly, right now, the things that are happening around us at this time are incredible. I think that one of the things about the Caribbean, one of the things about islands, is that you are in some ways cut off. You know yourself to be somewhat secluded, but you're also extremely vulnerable. You're particularly vulnerable to the decisions of others. I think the idea, I wanted to just look at the idea of the nod to the future generations. And I'm glad that Karen brought that up, because it was meant to be more than a nod, more of a salute, I think, to those who will be thrown unprepared into a struggle against almost overwhelming odds. How will our grandchildren and great-grandchildren make their way through a world where so many of the most powerful are corrupt or inept, and where environmental disasters are reeling out of control? So I was very, very aware of the effects that Karen is talking about, and the shattering effects, and the fact that all of that, what has been really perpetrated on us, is really going to affect the generations to come far more than it's affecting ourselves, although some of us are already in deep straits.
In addition to that, we also have another question from a different author, Barbara Jenkins, this time. And she says that, Professor Lalla, I've read all of your novels, and with each succeeding one, from Arch of Fire through Cascade, Uncle Brother, Grounds for Tenure, and now 1000 Eyes, I am reminded that the personal is political, and its corollary, the political is personal. It seems to me that there is a trajectory in the themes you explore in your novels: family secrets, aging, personal sacrifice for the family good, academic intrigue. In that, while the focus of your themes seem to widen outwards from the home to the workplace, there is still a personal connection, perhaps reflecting stages in your own life at the time of writing. That is, until 1000 Eyes, where the theme of environmental and societal breakdown seem not to have the same easy connection with the personal. Or does it? Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Well, thank you, BJ, for this careful reading, not only of my work, but of me. The truth is that 1000 Eyes is as personal to me as anything else I've written. And I'd pause and say that even my academic work, like Post-Colonialisms, which involved Caribbean rereadings of medieval verse, was as personal as it was political, but that's a discussion for another time. So I love this question. In 1000 Eyes, I threw myself into the possible futures that could unfold for those children who are most dear to us at present, like my grands, bright, independent, resilient children. What if they found themselves in a world other than what we want for them, a world other than they deserve? So there's an element of fable, parable, morality, drama, what you have you, but I depart from the real, the world we know as we know it, in the direction of fantasy, so as to contemplate how easily this world can slide, if left to go along its present track, into horror. We're talking here about a future for children. It doesn't get more personal than that, or more fraught with politics, unfortunately.
And it is a very, very much personal, political kind of thing. So I asked a question about genre earlier, and one of our submitted author questions takes up this thread as well. So referring to a keynote that you delivered in 2021 at UTT's Conference on Stylistics and Language Use in the Caribbean, Nicholas Laughlin wondered about your idea of the Caribbean otherwise, which he read as a concept that describes a particular mode of Caribbean fiction writing that cuts across genre, but uses elements of speculation, myth, and folklore to address Caribbean histories that realism seems inadequate to. He'd like to hear you talk more about this idea, which you developed in the process of writing this novel, and which seems really applicable to a wide range of our contemporary writers.
Yes, well, I think that there's always been that sort of negotiation between myth and history. And our critics have talked about it, about the histories that were written of us that were myth, and the things that would have been considered myth that were really our histories, and so on. So there's always been a bit of negotiation between that, and a recognition of it by critics. But of course, it's gone way back to our deepest history. The first Caribbean fiction the first Caribbean fictions that were written, written from the Eurocentric point of view, from the metropolitan elsewhere, essentially invented a Caribbean that was convenient. And there was nothing real in the presentation about what the Caribbean was. The voices were made up. You didn't have to know anything about how Caribbean voices sounded because they had got it wrong anyway. It was broken English as far as they were concerned. So they could just break English and it would be fine. So you would get voices that didn't sound in any way Caribbean and so on. So that whole struggle for writers from within the Caribbean, one of the first things I think was to insist on the idea that there was a real Caribbean. But I think even to this day, there is not always that acceptance of it. There is still often in the treatment of the Caribbean from outside, a bit of that fancifulness, a bit of making us up. The tropical paradise, the tourist place, and so on and so forth. And I was interested in dealing with some of these issues, of looking at strange developments to what can happen to tourism, for example, in this novel. Even sometimes you get Caribbean writers writing back to the Caribbean who have moved away. And sometimes you get a brilliant insight from somebody who is seeing us from the outside very sharply. And sometimes you don't. You get pieces and bits of pieces that are put together from memories that are a little out of date and this kind of thing. So I think that sense of trying to figure out what is real and what is not real in projecting the Caribbean is important. And I think sometimes to see something, to see reality, you have to turn it around a little bit. You have to produce a what if that might seem fanciful, and that allows you to look at it from a completely different angle. And I think that was what I was trying to do.
Yeah, I think you definitely do that too. What struck me about a lot of the ways in which the child characters try to apprehend new experiences or things or people that they meet is that they often will resort to giving them folkloric names or having reference to a deeper past that they themselves might not always understand even. Yeah, so I think for sure, I mean, it is part of the way, a very kind of Caribbean way of a Caribbean lens of seeing things through past, deep past, all kinds of levels of past as well. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that, for example, since you mentioned folklore again, the whole idea of the children not being seen as real at many points, as being seen as duendes, and yet there is an element of reality in the fact that they have been cast out, they have been cast aside, they have been blocked out in many ways. So I think that that there is a lot in the Caribbean mythology and in Caribbean folklore that can be brought in to demonstrate that balance between reality, imagination, myth.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and again, it's also a kind of a political thing too. I mean, our way of seeing the world is just as legitimate as any other mythology that any other culture might have constructed to view their world and so on as well. I mean, the title of the novel is premised on a kind of mythologizing thing that's going on as well in the novel. I won't spoil that too much, but yes, there's always this element of mythology. There's this element of the fantastic that the children are existing next to. So related to that then, here's another one from Karen Lord. Some readers think that a child protagonist or point of view equals children's book. What readership age range were you writing for when you wrote 1000 Eyes?
Well, no, we come to a pet peeve of mine, the idea that books about children are books for children. I think what drives that is an element of reverse truth, that books for children are often about children. I was very much in the grip of that dilemma when I began writing, because I wanted to write an exciting story set in the Caribbean for my grandchildren. It was as mundane as that. I didn't see why that wouldn't be easy. I tell them stories all the time. But I quickly discovered that writing threw me automatically into adult mode. And I just couldn't write the little children's story. So I said, fine, young adult. But my concerns about children seem to be irretrievably grandmotherly. I get caught up in things I hardly considered even as a parent. Long-term issues in child development that most young parents haven't time to consider. With, you know, what will there still be a habitable world when they grow up? One that hasn't been washed or burnt away or poisoned beyond reclaim. So quickly, the story about children turned into one for older readers, though hopefully one that children of today will read in a few years. In that sense, it still is for them. I'm not too comfortable setting an age group anyway, because many of us were reading Dickens and Hawthorne when we were 12. So I mean, I don't really have an age group, but that is really how I did start out, thinking I was going in one direction and just gradually found myself being swept in another.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think too that perhaps we agonize a little bit too much about age ranges when it comes to what children read and things like that. I mean, it depends on the child, and you have to know what your child is interested in and what your child might be ready for as well. I mean, there's very little in here that I wouldn't recommend to someone who is younger. You know, it deals with things that are very pertinent and pertinent to, in particular, their generation. So I feel, you know, ascribing age ranges it can be very problematic when it comes to reading material. Okay, good. So I think then we've kept you very long at this point. So I think we can wrap up with one last question from author Shivani Ramlochan. Has the writing of a modern dystopian novel opened new pathways of being in the world for you, as distinct to your previous novels? Do you think the project of caring for our natural Caribbean is now inextricably tied to future literary projects you will center?
New pathways. Well, very much so, Shivani. In my earlier novels, the physical Caribbean was crucial to setting and circumstance, most noticeably perhaps in Grounds for Tenure. But in this one, there's no cradling family, not even a coherent academic system to test a new and chaotic one against. Here, there is wilderness. The children have to build community from ground zero. They have only contradictory information and speculation. There are roads, but no idea in this landscape of a safe path. Current crises that beset us now in real life on planet Earth hinge on our relation to the natural world. I don't know anything that we can do from here on that can make sense, except in that context. Mind you, I am subject to sudden and radical shifts of attention, so I won't write another speculative novel right away. But for me, for now, there's no escaping the ultimate context of the wider planet. My next novel is actually set in the onrush of the pandemic, in the world as we now know it, but which most of us could never have envisioned 3 years ago. It would have been speculative if I had written it then.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Barbara. This has been excellent. And we can turn it over to the rest of today's program. That was Barbara, Lalla, and me in conversation about 1000 Eyes, now out from UE Press. The book can be bought via the UE Press website, through Amazon, and your local bookstore now. Links can be found at the bottom of this YouTube video. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Barbara one last time for some closing remarks. Thank you.
I am so grateful for the opportunity for us to meet, however virtually, so as to celebrate 1000 Eyes. I'm especially thankful for my dear friends, Professor Morgan, for her insightful and witty review of the book, and Ryan Dergasing for chairing the function, engaging me in the interview, and keeping me sane throughout the preparation. My readers, where would I be without the readers who sent in fascinating questions? Then, I appreciate the support from the Department of Literary, Cultural, and Communication Studies, and particularly Roger McFarlane for his technical expertise. I thank UWE Press for publishing my work and for launching it, and especially for supporting me in the production process to the absolutely best editors in the world, Siobhan Hearn and Alison Latta, who have been amazing. Thank you, friends, far and near, for joining me this afternoon. I also thank my beloved family, my husband, my sons, and the daughters and grands they have blessed me with, and my entire wide family circle for believing in me the whole way. And I thank God.